The next part of this shift mechanism we need to take off is called the stopper arm. And if you can see, if you look really closely right here, there's a blue spring and it wraps around the other side and it keeps tension on this. So to get this off, we just need to loosen this bolt. This is an Allen bolt. It's a 5mm Allen head. This, if installed properly, should have been installed with some locking compound on it, so I might have to use the air wrench. Nope, it looks like it's just going to come off. So there it is. Now we can pull this stopper arm, and there's a washer that goes behind it, the spring, and the bolt that we just took out. So we'll keep these all together with the rest of the shift mechanism. Now we need to remove, this is the gear shift cam, this piece right here. So we need to remove this Allen nut from the center of this cam so we can pull this off. So I believe there's a dowel behind this too also. This is a 6mm, if you can read that, Allen wrench. But the first thing we need to do is turn this counterclockwise until it stops. Now I know this one has some thread locker on it, so I'm gonna try to use my electric drill, but we'll see what happens. That is not gonna get that one. We're gonna have to use the air wrench to get this one off. I've got my trusty air wrench now. Let's give this a try. Alright. So there is the shift cam off. And I believe this dowel pin probably needs to come out also. And there's the dowel pin. Now we've got to take this apart. This is the main bearing here, and this is the set plate that holds it on. These are 10mm bolts. Not sure if they have thread locker on them. I'm going to try to get them off with my electric drill. So we'll make sure when we put this back on, you can see it says outside on it, and we'll put the bolts in the bag. Now we're ready to take or start taking the case halves apart, and to do that there are bolts on the upper side, this side, and there are bolts on the underside. So we're going to do the upper side first, and you can see there's all these bolts here. There's 10 or 12 different bolts here that need to come off of this upper side first. And one thing that I usually do is, I know you'll laugh at this, but I kind of draw an outline of the engine. It doesn't have to be perfect, obviously. And then I kind of mark where all the bolts go. And as I take them off of here, I'll put them in here. Just a very easy way to keep track of where your bolts go for later. So there are several 10mm bolts, and I'm going to take off first. I believe the rest of these are 12s. And one thing I do want you to notice is there are two. This bolt, you see, has a sealing washer on it, a copper washer. And straight across from that, there's another, this 10mm bolt also has a sealing washer on it. So we need to make sure these stay in these spots. I'm going to go ahead off camera and get this other 12 off of here. And I'll get these bagged up, and then we're going to turn the engine over and do the bottom side. So you can see now I've got all the bolts out and in their appropriate spots on here, so I won't lose track of where they came from. Got the engine turned upside down now. You can see we have a 14mm bolt here. There's several 10mm bolts and a couple of 12s, and they're all around here. So I'm just going to create another pattern on the cardboard just like I did for the top, and we'll do this. just going to loosen up all the 10mm bolts first. I think that's all the 10s. Maybe the 12s. Yeah, I think my power drill is running out of torque here, or battery, so I'm going to switch over to the air. Alright, switched over to air. I think this one is a 14. Okay, so I've got all these bolts loose. I'm just going to get them put in my cardboard template. We've got all the bolts out now. Move you back just a little bit. Now we should be able to tap this bottom half up and separate the two halves. Give that a try. Okay, so we've got it apart. There is the lower half, the gear shift drum and forks. We'll take care of those here in a little bit. One thing I will say is not to lose this. Now I'm going to have to figure out where that came from because I'm not sure. So we'll figure that out in a minute. Now that we've got these two halves apart, you can see the shift drum and forks here. Just keep track of how these go in. We'll just keep track of those. We're going to take this whole mechanism out. They're all 10mm bolts. So I'll take off these two 10mm bolts, and we're also going to pull the oil pump out while we're here. And this fork tube will just slide out. You want to keep track of the forks. So we're just going to take them out. We're going to put them back on this tube in the same order that they came off. Just like so. And set those aside for a minute. We're going to try and push the shift drum out. So the shift drum, this is the shift drum. It comes out with this bearing. Keep it together with the shift drum. We're going to bag all these things up. We're going to take the oil pump off also. And the oil pump should just slide straight out, just like so. So we're just going to bag these up also together. Now I'm going to take out, these are the transmission gears, and these are the gears that slide back and forth when you're shifting gears. You know, in certain configurations they'll be in first gear or second gear through sixth. And these, I know, are in good shape, so I don't have any intention of rebuilding these. And these just pull out. So you can just pull these straight out. I'm going to pull them out like this, leave them together. Just like so. I'm just going to bag them up together and get on with pulling the crank and the pistons out. So I forgot to mention, I remember them once I took the transmission gears out, but right here, these two little things are called oil orifices. They let oil flow around from the inside of the crank. And these just pull out. They look like so. Kind of a half moon shape on one side and a hole. So there's two of them here. Just make sure you don't lose these. Down to some of the final things that we need to take off of here. So this is the crankshaft. And the pistons are down in here, if you can see them. down inside there. And they're connected to the crankshaft by these connecting rods. Here, 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 here. And I'm going to go ahead and take these connecting rod nuts loose, take these caps off, and then we should be able to pull the crankshaft out of the engine. Get you set up and we'll do that. This is the number 1 cylinder, since it's upside down. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just going to loosen these, but we need to put these and make sure we put them back in the same cylinder that we took them off of. So these connecting rod caps should come off now. So it looks like I'm going to have to work at them a little bit. I'll be back. I've gotten the number 1 cap off. And one thing you want to be very careful about is to make sure that when you take them off, when we put them back on, you'll notice there's a small indentation on this side. And that should point toward the left-hand side of the engine when we put these back on. But also, very importantly, there are bearings inside here. This little piece right here, and it can come out. I'm just going to leave them in there. They don't look horrible. They're not scored. But each one of these, on each side of this piston, is going to have one side of this bearing, half of this bearing. So make sure that you don't lose these, and make sure you put them back on the piston and on the journal. So this will be piston number 1. So this is journal number 1. Piston journal number 1. You want to make sure you put these, because they've worn together, so they know each other. So we're going to make sure we get them put back together. We've got all the piston caps taken off. We should be able to lift this crankshaft. Now I've pushed these pistons down a little bit so they're kind of out of the way. We should be able to lift this crankshaft out of here now. Just like so. I'm going to wrap this up safe, get it put away. So we're going to take these pistons out. But what we do want to keep track of is the cylinder they're in. So this side is number 1. So I'm just going to write the number 1 on it if I can. And I don't really know if I'll be able to. So that's 1, you can kind of see it. 2, 3, and 4. So we're going to bag these up with the caps that came off of these pistons too. But it is kind of nice to have them numbered. And when we put them back in, you'll notice here, it's kind of upside down right now, but this says in. This in, when we put these back in, will always point towards the intake side of the engine, which is this side. So exhaust side, intake side, and the word in. So that'll make sure we get these back in order and back positioned correctly. So this is number 4 piston. I've got the engine kind of set on its side right now, so I can push the piston out through the back. But just so you can see how this comes out, it shouldn't be too hard to push them out. And then you can just pull the piston out. And there is the number 4 piston. And there's the bore that the piston runs in. Not horrible. I still see some cross hatching, so this engine's barely worn in. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the pistons just like this one. I think that wraps up the teardown of the engine. We've got both sides of the engine, one over here, one here, and the head in the back of the garage somewhere, torn down to where we can start cleaning them up and do the magnaflux test on them. I did just notice one thing that I'm going to want to do. I forgot to take out these crank bearings. So we're going to take these out and get these stored in a safe place. And I believe there's going to be another set that matches in the top of the engine over there. Welcome back, everybody. Now that we have the entire engine apart, the head and the two case halves, we're going to check them for cracks. And the way we're going to do that, since this is aluminum, is we can't use a Magnaflux, so we're going to use a spray-on crack detection kit. And this one's from Cantesco. It's got a cleaner, it's got a penetrant, and it's got a developer. And I'm going to go through the process of how to use these. And we're going to test this. First of all, we'll do the head. Now, I've already sprayed the cleaner on, and I've just got it out here in the sun letting it dry. Once this is dry, we'll come back and I'll show you how to use the penetrant and the developer. I've let this dry for about 5 minutes after the cleaner, and it says to use a lint-free towel, but I'm just going to use one of these oil towels, the blue towels you get from anywhere, just to wipe it down really quickly. It's fairly dry now, so now we're going to spray on the penetrant. Now we're going to spray on this Cantesco penetrant, and we just need to spray, you know, a semi-liberal coat on there, and then we have to let it sit for what they call a dwell time. This is a drying time, and it lets any of this penetrant soak into any of their cracks that might be on the surface of this. So we'll spray this on, and we'll wait 5 minutes. And as you noticed, I've kind of set it up. It says you should set it up so that it has a way to drain the excess off the surface while it dries. So we're just going to let this dry. So we've waited 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more, and you can see it's pretty dry. The dye has had time to soak into any cracks that could be present in this head on this side. So now we're going to take, again, the cleaner, and I'm going to spray it on a towel, not directly on here, because I don't want to wash any dye that had penetrated into any of the cracks out of the crack. So we're just going to wipe this down real quick. I'll get you set up and do that. Okay, so I've just got a blue towel here and the cleaner. So you can see we've got the surface wiped down. I'm going to let this dry for a couple of minutes, and I'll come back and we'll put on the developer. Well, we've given 5 minutes to allow the cleaner that we put on here. So we've cleaned it, dried, put the penetrant on, dried, cleaned again, and dried. Now it's time to put on the developer. And what this is, I've shaken it up already for a few minutes. This is a white powdery kind of paint, and what it's going to do is allow where there are any cracks with the red penetrant still in them, it's going to show through this paint. So we're going to get this put on there, and it's got a 10-minute minimum dry time or dwell time and a maximum dwell time of 60 minutes. So we'll come back and check it at 10 minutes, see if we've got any cracks. We should be able to see them if there are going to be any there, but try to check this within a maximum amount of 60 minutes, or you will lose the definition. It will bleed across and you won't be able to see the cracks very well defined. So let's get it sprayed on and go from there. Okay, so we've got that sprayed on. We're going to let that sit for at least 10 minutes, no more than 60. So this head looks absolutely fine. I'll get a little bit closer here, and you can see if I go across this head, you don't see any cracks. A crack would show up, I would expect it to be, you know, between here and a water column or something, since what we were seeing was liquid in the oil, and it would show up as a red line somewhere around here, very similar to this. This is just part of the red stuff that I did not get cleaned up. That's why it's showing as red, but these are not cracks. These are just red that I didn't clean up. But I do not see any cracks in this at all. So I think this head, I'm going to call it good. Now that we've cleared the head, I'm going to check the cylinder body here that's on the upper part of the crankcase. And I have already sprayed the cleaner on here and let it dry. So we're just going to spray the penetrant on right now, just like we did the last time. Penetrant is on. We'll give that 5 minutes to dry. The penetrant, you can see, has had 5 minutes to dry. We're just going to use the cleaner again here on a towel. We're going to give that just a couple of minutes to dry, and we will again spray the developer on. So it's been 5 minutes. We're going to again spray the developer on the surface that we just cleaned and put the penetrant on. We've sprayed the developer on. We're going to let that sit at least 10 minutes, and we'll ensure there are no cracks in this cylinder bore. We waited just around 10 minutes. I'll get real close to this too, and you can see, again, this is just bleed over because there was some wet penetrant still in that dowel hole. But if we go along the surface here, I don't see any cracks. So I'm going to call this cylinder bore section good also. Now that we've done the penetration dye testing and determined that there's no cracks in any of this, we can start to put the engine back together knowing that we don't have any cracks to worry about. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check the clearance of the crankshaft journals and bearings. So you can see these are the crankshaft bearings that we took out previously. Right after we took the crankshaft out, I put them in this half of the engine, and I've also put them back in this half of the engine in the position that they were in, and we know what position they were in because we bagged them previously. So we're going to use a piece of plastic on each of these called plastic gauge. And essentially what it does is we're going to put the crankshaft in, we're going to put a piece of plastic on it, we're going to put the halves together, we're going to torque it down to spec, and then we're going to take them back apart and we're going to measure how far that plastic got smashed. So I'm going to get you set up and I'll show you how to do that. I've set the crankshaft in here into the proper position. One of the things that you don't want to do is that we're going to be putting the plastic on the tops of these journals. And we don't want to be putting it across any of these holes, these oil valleys. So we're going to turn the crankshaft until we've got all of those out of the way. So you can see this journal, this one, all these journals, there's no hole. And then we're going to wipe these down a little bit, maybe even with a little bit of brake cleaner to get all the oil off. And then we'll put this half on and we'll torque it down. So let's get to that. Each one of these bearings, the connecting rod bearings, the crankshaft bearings, any of the bearings in there are going to have a specific tolerance. And in this case, we're looking at the crankshaft main bearing oil clearance. So if you look at the clearance, the specification is from 0.020 through 0.038 millimeters, or 0.0008 to 0.0015 inches. We're going to just use the millimeters testing, and to do that you need a sheet of this green plastic gauge, and you can see this goes from 0.25 to 0.76. So it will smash down to anything between these two tolerances. So we're going to tear off a piece of this and put it on each of these journals and get it smashed. So now you can probably barely see this plastic gauge on there, but there it is. I've got one on each of these journals. So we'll get the upper piece on, get it torqued down. So I've hand put the bolts in And we need to tighten these kind of in a clockwise circular order, starting with, we'll start here in the middle, go this way, and in 2 increments. So we're going to go, these in the end are 18 pounds, 18 foot-pounds of torque. I've got my wrench, my torque wrench set to 10 foot-pounds right now. So we're going to tighten all these down in order to 10 foot-pounds of torque, and then we'll go around again a second time and tighten them all down to 18. And just for reference, this is a 12 millimeter bolt. These are 12 millimeter bolts. So let's get these tightened up to 10. We've got them to 10. I'm going to go to 18, and we'll do them in the same order. So we've got them all tightened down to 18. And we make sure you don't spin this crankshaft. So now that we've put the correct torque on these, we're going to take them back out, and then we're going to look and see what the plastic gauge looks like. I'm going to take these out off camera, and I'll show you when I've got them back apart. So I've taken the upper crankcase apart, and here on this journal we can see that the plastic gauge has been smashed. So we're going to take our measuring tool that comes on the plastic gauge itself, and you can see, if you remember, this was between 0.020 and 0.038 tolerance. So anywhere in those first two is going to be really good. So let's put this on here. I can hold the camera still for you. You can kind of see it's pretty close to 0.25. So we know it's somewhere between 0.25 and 0.38. So this one is good. Let's look at the rest. We're going to call the crankshaft journals and bearings good. I'll wipe this off of here. I don't know that there's actually a need to, it's just wax, but I'll get it wiped off anyway, and I'll get it wiped off the other bearings, and we will do this same test with the piston connecting rod bearings. Hey everybody, it's been a little while since I've worked on this engine. We have checked this surface for cracks. We found none with the dye penetrant test. We checked the head, both sides, with the dye penetrant test, found no cracks. So I'm going to go ahead and put this engine back together. The first thing we need to do is put the pistons back in. And I'm going to go over a few things with these pistons first. One of the things you want to do before you just slam these pistons back in here is the threads on these can be very sharp and score the crankshaft when you put the crankshaft in, or these cylinder bores. So we don't want that to happen. I've just put some plastic tubing. It's just cheap plastic tubing over these bolts, just to keep them from scoring. And on the side here, there's a very sharp, if I take this off, you can see there's a really sharp edge right here. And when we're pushing that in here, that has a chance of scoring that cylinder bore also. So I've just wrapped some duct tape around it. That will come off as soon as we flip this over, before we put the crankshaft in. But one of the first things we want to do is notice on these pistons, you can see there's a smaller set of indentations here, and these are the exhaust side. The exhaust valves are smaller. These larger ones are the intake side, because the intake valves are larger. So this is actually upside down from the way we're going to put it in, but I wanted to show you this right here. This says in. IN, that means intake. So this will point to the intake, this side. This will point to the intake side of the engine. So we're actually going to install the piston this way when it goes in the engine, so that we have the intake pointing on the intake side. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you can see there are 3 sets of rings. There is this ring right here that looks kind of like I don't know if I can get that to focus. It looks like kind of corrugated cardboard, and it consists of a very small flat ring, this corrugated ring in the middle, and another very small flat ring above it. So there's actually 3 rings in this one ring set, and this is called the oil scraper. There's another flatter ring here, so there's the oil scraper, there's a secondary ring, and there's a primary ring at the top. And the thing we want to do is, we can see there are gaps in these rings, obviously, because they need to be compressed. But we want to make sure those gaps are not lined up with the other rings. So if we look at this ring, you can see right here, if you look close enough, let me see if I can get the light on it, that top ring has a gap right there. And we want this gap for the top ring and the gap for the bottom ring to be at least 20 millimeters apart from each other. And I don't even see where that other bottom ring is. So it's way over here. So they are way more than 20 millimeters apart. So that's fine. And then the next thing we want to do is make sure that this secondary ring gap is at least 120 degrees from the gaps on these. So if I want to put my finger right here where the small gap is, and I will put my finger where the bigger gap is for the secondary ring, and they look like they're right about 120 degrees apart. So here's the gap for the secondary ring. And lastly, we want to make sure that the gap for the secondary ring and the primary ring are at least 120 degrees apart. So we will look here and here, and they look like they're where my fingers are right here. One gap here, one gap here. So they look like they are about 120 degrees apart. So technically we've got gap here, and gap here. So they're not lined up directly in line with each other. So that's how you set the ring positioning on the piston. Now let's go over the tools we're going to need for this. First, we're going to need, obviously, the piston assembled and positioned. Secondly, this is a ring compressor. And then we're going to need just a little bit of engine oil or some assembly lube to put around here and inside here so that it will slide easily on here. So let's go get that oil, and I'll show you how to put the pistons in.